Hello, I'm Vic Vogel. Welcome to my podcast. Well, it's something that's been baffling me for a long time, but it's all beginning to kind of come together to me. Now, one of the skill sets I've had, and I've had all my life, I used as a consultant and various other things, has been the ability to connect dots, to pick out different things that are going on, see how they kind of connect, and then from that maybe draw a picture of what might happen next. And in some cases you can turn around and look backwards on that and kind of take a look at some of the things that have gone on in the past at various different levels or different time periods, pull those together and kind of see how they're connecting to what has come into fruition today. Today, we're going to be talking about how things got where they are in this country politically and the frustration level that we're experiencing today in the country. So we're going to speak about that. We're going to talk about it in two parts. First of all, a little bit of history that maybe you're not aware of unless you've taken the time to look at it. And the other part is how it kind of ties to the radical movements that are out there going on and how those are being used. So that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about that coming right up. Now, kind of what got me going on all this is as you go down through various forums and social media, whether it's Twitter, TikTok, well, not so much TikTok, but maybe Instagram or Facebook or some of the other traditional social media issues. And then a lot of the newscasts, people are becoming confused. For example, we had an insurrection on January 6th to try and stop the government from completing its task of counting votes for the 2020 election. And during that time period, there was a lot of activity by Trump and his following from the Republican Party. And then we had a whole bunch of people who were from different radical movements. You had conspiracy theorists, you had white supremacists, you had evangelical radical right, militia. And so you had a varying degrees of people who were radical, but they did have a common thread, and that is they were anti-Biden government. They were anti-government now. They've probably always been anti-government, but they were empowered or they felt like they had made inroads during the Trump years. So that's something you need to understand as we kind of look back. And that's what I was going, why were, some of these radical movements like white supremacy, they simply want all people who are not, quote, pure white bread out of the country. They don't feel like they need to be an American. Then you had the evangelical right who really want to create a theocracy so that the evangelical or the Christian religion will be the predominant religion of this country. And that's what will guide the policy making. So you had that group of people. Then you also had the militia who were just anti-government. They don't want any regulation. They wanted no taxation. They want to set up their own environments and live the way they want to live. And there were different militias. Some of them are a little more radical than others. So they have an anti-government agenda. And then you had this conspiracy theorists, which came out of nowhere. And now what these all had in common were two things. First of all, they were basically cults. They all have a cult ring or tone to them. The people had to join them. People could not leave without being ridiculed. People had to behave a certain way. They had to adapt certain issues. They had to, even to the point of uniforms or specific patches or things, slogans, languages, code words, a lot of things like that. You found in the conspiracy theorist group, you found them in the white supremacist group, you found them in the evangelical right group. I know I was in that group for a while and managed to escape. So I'm very aware and astute of all of these things and understand how they can control your life. And you also had that in the militia groups. And so although some of these groups had differing perspectives of why they were doing it, they did all of them have two things in common. They had cult-like behaviors that were extremely domineering and were extremely controlling, and they all were anti-government. They wanted the United States government to have less influence on what they were doing. So they had those two things in common. And in some ways, you could see how if they had those things in common, they kind of behaved the same way. They lived the same kind of life. They had different rules and policies for white supremacists than the militia did, than the evangelical church did, than the conspiracy theorists did. Different languages, different codes, but somehow they all had that basic cult underpinning in terms of how you were supposed to live and behave. And they definitely were all anti-regulation, anti-government. And so when Trump came into power, he tapped into this. He saw this. He tapped into this. And that began to unite all of those groups into one basic, what you now call the radical right group. They're sort of all lumped together, even though they had different objectives initially. They still had those two underpinning things. They were cult-oriented in their behaviors, and they were definitely anti-regulation, anti-government. So, you look at that and you say, okay, Donald Trump was in office 4 years. During those 4 years, he rallied those people unbelievably on a consistent basis. He became the cult leader, if you will. And because he was the Republican, because he controlled the number of people that he controlled in the Republican Party, which basically most of them now considered, at least to some extent, a large portion, or not a large portion, maybe a third or a half of that group fall under this these definitions of radical right groups. The others all of a sudden realized if their party was split, they were not going to have the power to win anything from Democrats or anybody else. So you can see how this became an extremely disconcerting dilemma for the Republican Party. Half their party was radical right, and they were pushing some very radical stuff. The more conservatives didn't like that point of view, but they knew if they didn't at least appease them, they wouldn't have enough votes to beat the Democrats. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened in 2020. Now, from that point on, it became, oh, well, the Republican Party is split. They're sort of, not in line with each other. They're the two groups, the conservatives and the radicals, are not comfortable with what's going on. And so they start going to try to appease each other. Well, actually, the conservative Republicans were trying to appease the radical rights enough to vote for them. And they became more and more swinging, more radical right, because Trump had strong control over those other groups because they have cult behavior. He was using cult concepts and techniques, to control them. He was using all the buzzwords, lock her up, and he was getting them whipped up into a frenzy. And that's what you do to get your cult membership to follow you, as you keep them excited, emotionally driven, but you keep them ignorant about what's going on. But excited about the idea that, we may have a theocracy, or maybe we'll do away with all the government regulations. And this conspiracy thing, a lot of these conspiracy things, the idea that Hillary Clinton was promoting a sex child ring in a pizza parlor, things like that were exciting and got people energized. Okay. So Trump kept that side going. The conservatives couldn't overcome that. So they had to start living with it. It's kind of like COVID. You can't overcome it, but you got to start living with it. So they try to move more towards that direction. And you had Congress people who were also moving that direction. Now, there's a reason why people in Congress who knew better, who didn't want the country to be in that state, but they had another faction that they had to deal with besides the radical right, and that's what I want to talk about next. So, as I understand, just looking into the history of things, we kind of go back before somewhere around the early 1900s, when industrial people were beginning to happen in America, and things were getting, there were a few people who had money, who then got more money because they invested and they built things like railroads and steel mills and then later in life, we got into energy and fuel, and all of those things were building extremely wealthy empires, but only for very few people. And these people became the old money, or the rich families in the countries in the early 1900s. They were also the ones that survived the Great Depression in the 1920s. They had the money to survive, while other people were just flat out, broke and destitute, and a bunch of other things. So they were taking that money and putting it into different things, and they were inventing, and they were innovating, and they were making things happen in the country. And they were actually involved in making things happen in other parts of the world. We know that the Fords, or the Ford Motor Company, were involved with Hitler in Germany. We know the Koch family, who had a patent on refining fuels, the fuel that came out of Canada that was really raw and tough to deal with. They had developed a patent to refine it real well, so that it could be used in things like aircraft and things like that, for aircraft fuel. We know they went and worked with Hitler to develop fuel refineries while he was building his Nazi empire over there. And so there were these rich families. It wasn't necessarily the government of the United States or the people of the United States who were involved in these scenarios, but these companies were. Some of these people, like the Koch family and others, had a bent towards racism. And so, maybe it came out of the Civil War, where slave ownership and everything were historically part of their roots coming into the country. They brought with them that sort of racial undertone to them, and the idea of inequality was important to them. In other words, they were the ones who created everything. Everybody else really wasn't that important to building their empire, but they needed them to do the work. But you kind of had to keep them pushed down in society. So we began to see the inequity build between the average citizen in the country, starting way back in the 20s and 30s, and began to continue to prosper along those lines as these rich families began to control more and more of what was going on. I call them the super rich. So these super rich then began to get together because they knew that the average citizen had a vote. Okay. And they saw that people who were struggling during the 30s and 40s and those periods, they were beginning to struggle, and they were beginning to use their vote to put people into office that would help them with things like Social Security and income tax. Well, income tax came into being because it was a methodology to help people out in the general public that were struggling with things. You have consumer affairs, you have, Medicare, Medicaid, all of those came as a result of these kinds of behaviors. And because we were collecting taxes, well, these families initially were definitely not into wanting taxes. So there were no income taxes up until that point. So and that meant that all of a sudden, some of the money that they earned was being put down into that group of people that they were trying to control and maneuver. And so inequality began to sort of, get closer and closer to an equal financial environment. It wasn't going to be perfect, but people were beginning to use the money that rich people were putting into the income tax system for benefiting the average person out there that wasn't rich. So that was going on. And so these rich families began to get together. Certain groups of them, not everybody, but certain groups of them began together, and they controlled enough of the wealth in the country that they began to figure out and try to figure out how they could control and gain back this initial power that they had early in the 1900s, which, they didn't have unions, so they could work kids all kinds of hours of the days, and they could treat anybody, and there was no health care. There was none of this stuff for the average worker. And as this evolved, it was costing these people some of their wealth to take care of the people who were working their companies and and also people in the country. So this is all kind of coming in, but these cabals I call them cabals, they were beginning to try to figure out how to maneuver so that they could create a government that was anti-regulation. In other words, there would be only two regulations that the government would be responsible for: protecting people's property, which was important to them because they had oil leases, they had industries, they had all of this stuff that were assets or properties. So they wanted the government regulation to protect their right to have those in their properties and to get more of them. Okay. But not necessarily a lot of protections for the people that were working for them or the citizens in the country. And they kept seeing it move that direction. They kept seeing our government move more and more towards with income tax and Social Security and the deals where they were building things, programs that the government would fund that would allow people to earn a wage that weren't able to work prior to that. All those kinds of things were going on in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and on into the 50s. And there was this at the same time, these families, these cabals of the super rich, were very much focused on creating radical attitudes and minds. They were bigots. They were racist. If you look into their family lives, they had a lot of authoritarianism in them, and they were very disruptive. Yeah, we would call them dysfunctional families today. So a lot of them were, not all of them, but a lot of them were. And again, it wasn't everybody was rich. We're talking about the mega rich, the super rich, the 1%ers out there in the world. And they were trying to pull together. And that's how groups like the John Birch Society came together, highly ultra conservative, but beyond conservative, almost anti-government and absolute controlism. I don't know that you would call it fascism per se in its, strongest sense of the word. But they admired people like Adolf Hitler and Mussolini and people like that, and even Stalin going into Russia in that early period. These were people who had control over their people. They were ironclad, iron-fisted control over people. They also wanted to expand their control. So this was something that they really appreciated and caught their eye, and they admired this kind of authoritarianism. And so they began to meet and try to formulate organizations, but given the laws and regulations of the country, they couldn't just go out and do it. They had to figure out how to do it. So like a lot of this dark money was put into funds and grants for universities, or they weren't universities, they were think tanks or things like that. That they could take for tax deductions, but the tax deduction was going towards something that they created that was going to try to figure out how to deregulate the government and move the government out of a less democratic, social-oriented government into a more authoritarian and capitalistic government. And so it's not that capitalism is bad, because a lot of innovation has come out. I mean, the automobile came out of the Ford Group. Fuel refinery came out of the Koch family. These all were beneficial to our country for a long time, but they just wanted to control it. They wanted to have absolute control over the government, is what it amounted to. So I don't know that that's fascism, but it's certainly a form of it. It's definitely authoritarianism by its definition. So that's what's going on. And what happened was they began to realize as they come into the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s that, the movement of helping people out there and trying to take care of American citizens was growing, and that was a problem for them. So they have to figure out how do we get our fingers into this in a way that can stop it. And they worked their way into Reagan, in the Reagan area, where they really got this going on, and they got trickle down economy, and they began to get a lot of tax breaks. In fact, they did tax breaks for both companies and the average citizen out there. But the problem was when they did it, and it's kind of the same way it happened in 2017 when Trump did his tax cut. The super rich got a tremendous tax cut. The average person got about a coffee a day worth of increased tax or decreased taxes. In other words, they might be able, if it was the less expensive 7-Eleven coffee, that's about what they got out of it. And in the end, as if inflation hit like it's done in the pandemic, they've actually lost in the end. But the super rich continue to get super rich. And it's because they can take all the money they make and put it into different IRS tax dodges that allow them not to have to. I mean, they put their money into all kinds of things that don't get taxed, and then they go borrow money to do the things they want to do out there in the world. Okay, and so that imbalance, the average person can't do. They don't. My average person, vast majority of them don't even have $1,000 in the bank today, and you see how that in their objective has always been to keep a financial inequity so they have control, and then to take that control and move it towards an anti-government attitude that will keep regulation out of it. They're not talking about doing away with freedom, like people keep saying it's fascism. I'm not quite sure it's fascism yet. At least I don't think it is yet, because then the leader takes control. Now, what happened is they may have made a mistake with backing Donald Trump, and all of them did back Donald Trump. All this money was going into Donald Trump because they figured they could maneuver him, they could control him and begin to get all these regulations out of here. And Trump was doing that for him for a while. He was knocking out the EPA. He was knocking out the consumer protection programs. He was on track for exactly what they wanted to have happen. Problem is, Trump got caught up in being his own cult leader. And these people, and this could happen to a cult leader. I mean, this is why a cult leader becomes a cult leader, because he's a narcissist and he needs his attention. So what happens is he gets these people all riled up, and the people get excited about him out there. That this large group of people that voted him into office because they didn't like the government, what was going on before, because all through history, the Republicans have put us into recessions and the Democrats have got us out. I mean, you just look at the data and you see that's the case. Well, all through that 10 years or so, or 8 years that Obama was president, he was bringing us out of recession very rapidly, really. But that's not, you're in a position where that's not admired by the average person out there is suffering at the same time. They don't appreciate you bringing them out because they're suffering during that. And then when you finally get there, along comes Trump. And after all that antagonism that people have had, and it's built up in these groups that these already radical super rich cabals believe. I mean, they believe the same way. They're going, hey, here's a target audience we have that we can really rally on our side. Boom. If they were independent and they were militia, or if they were, even if they didn't have a party and they were white supremacists or whatever, all of a sudden these groups are going, hey, we got this one person we can rally around who's telling us, hey, I'm going to give you a theocracy. I'm going to give you a more white country, and I am behind law enforcement and militia because I know more than our military. So, and all our law enforcement combined, and probably more than all our judges combined. So that began to be the whole issue. Let's put judges in place. It wasn't about helping America. It was how many judges we can put in place, how many agencies can we gut and get rid of that were regulatory, and how many people can we rally they keep the noise up, so that's not really seen by, they're not seeing what's happening while this is going on. And that benefits the super rich cabals out there. That's what they wanted. That was heading right down that direction. But there's always, throughout this time, been one thing that has prevented that from happening to its ultimate extent. Everybody has one vote. And that one vote is equal for the poorest person, is just as equal for the poorest person as it is for the super rich person. And that super rich person only gets one vote. And no matter how you try to pile the money up and put them into super PACs, all these things that came with trying to buy votes, that's what all that was about. It's always been about that. And that it's not hard to see that. It's not hard to see that. But the fact is, that's where it's gone. And what they have done is they've rallied these radical right movements. I think in the end, what happened with Trump was they were getting frustrated with, the radicals were getting frustrated with Trump. There wasn't a theocracy change, and people were beginning to get frustrated with the economy. And then, of course, the real kicker with Trump, because he was inept, it wasn't so much that the cabals and the people weren't getting things moving. They were having things moving in the direction they wanted to go, but the pandemic got in the way. Maybe it was divine intervention, who knows? But the pandemic got in the way. You had a very inept leader. He wasn't a leader. He was a cult leader. He wasn't a leader in terms of America. Not suited for presidency whatsoever. And people were frustrated with that. And they saw, and Trump got more and more into himself and less into what the super rich wanted him to be and do. And then you began to get conflict within all of that. And so now what happens is you have an extremely split party. You still have that super rich cabals, those groups of rich families and all that money, that 1% that really want less regulation, and they still want to have that happen. But the problem is you also have the evangelical right that got whipped up, and they really want a theocracy, and they can't have that. They're not going to get that, and that frustrates them. And the militia, they just want government to go away, and they don't want to be taxed or anything in their life, and that's not going to happen. And consequently, the white supremacists are really frustrated because more and more they're becoming the minority versus the majority. So you have all that anguish and all that frustration going on, and the conservative Republican Party that isn't the Trump cult, that probably maybe a little over half of the conservative party and all of the independents are just confused. They don't, they see what's happening to Trump legally. They saw the insurrection, which they just can't understand, and didn't, and made all of those videotapes and all those speeches on the Senate floor just condemning Trump and saying, I don't want any part of this. A year later, they're saying, oh, it was just discord, it was disagreement. It was okay. It was maybe not best decision on how to do it, but yeah, it's all right. Now, and because they can't, they've had this splitting. And I think Trump was the splitting factor of all that. He's got a cult running around with him saying, hey, I don't care what he does. He's our leader. He must be right if he says it. It's almost like I'm just waiting on him to say he's, God. But then you have the rest of the party that is going, we're having a hard time living with that. We can't believe that, but we can't say we don't like it, because then we don't have the votes to win. And it's all about the votes, right? Not what's right. It's all about the votes. And the cabals are going, well, that's crazy. Now we don't know. We need to put our money behind somebody who's going to do what we want them to do. But we got this crazy cult faction over here going nuts, but we're going to try to use them. And so that's why you see a whole lot of conservative Republicans giving in or acquiescing to Trump's side of the picture, because they're pressured by the super rich. You get no money from us unless you line up with something that's going to put Republicans in there. Hopefully it's not going to be Trump, but it might be somebody who we can control. So therein lies the dilemma. That's what they're struggling with. That's why you have such a split in that party. As far as I can see it, that sort of makes sense to me, that they are, Trump wasn't what they thought he was, and he ended up fooling them to the point where they thought they had somebody they were going to control, and they couldn't. and now their dilemma is trying to hold that party together enough to get the votes. And the only way they can do that they can see, is to put the money behind the Republicans and maybe to buy off some Democrats like Sinema and Manchin, and try to keep enough votes so they have at least some control. Now, the dilemma here is going to be simple for them. Even if they got all those votes, enough votes to take control of the House, and maybe even a minority control of control of the Senate, but not enough to have a supermajority in either. They still have 2 more years after that where nothing's going to happen, because Biden will veto everything they put up there, and they can't override him unless they have a 2/3 majority. They're not going to get that. They are barely thinking about getting. They hope they get the House. They don't know about the Senate, but they hope they get the House. They hope they get one of those so that they can stop Biden's agenda. But just stopping Biden's agenda isn't necessarily going to satisfy that super rich category, because they want total control. So therein lies it. You have all that money behind this, and that's what's driving all of this. Flynn, Stone, Trump, all these guys are just puppets for the really, really dark and devious group that's underneath them. And they are uniting. You remember I told you there's 2 things that these radical groups had in common at the beginning. That was they are act like and react and respond to cult-like behavior. And they all anti-government. That anti-government aspect about them is the key thing that the super rich are trying to hang on to and manipulate. And they are using what I term psychological warfare. They are putting together very distinct undue influence educational programs, etc. They're creating environments. That's one reason why they want to change the educational system. Is you got to remember, they've been working on this since probably the 30s on through the 40s, probably longer than 80 years. They've been working on trying to get this into place, because once they get it there, it'll be hard to get out. So they're willing to wait a little longer so they can get people changing laws for the school system, controlling education. They can take the youth, kind of like Hitler was taking the youth and controlling what they learned and moving them up, thinking that they would be the next generation. That they had something bigger in mind than just that time period. So all of this kind of makes sense when you look at it that way. It's all underwritten by the super rich. And it's not hard to go back in history. There's a book called Dark Money by, I think it's Jane Mayer. She paints a really good outline of all of this history to this, and the history of the families who were bringing this money. And then you have Stephen Hassan's The Cult of Trump. Both of these books, along with some other really great books, and some history, you can just go back and look at the history. You can start pulling this information together, and it's painting a pretty clear picture of what's going on. It's we want a government that is not regulating anything, and consequently, you're not bringing any income in as a government. That the welfare of the people are going to rest with the super rich, and we see where that's taken us all through history. Okay. We have the largest inequity in our lifetime right now. You can't count on the rich to take care of you. It's just that simple. But you could count on the government, because we see those governments happening successfully in Norway and Sweden and Great Britain and other places that are industrial equals, maybe not quite as equal, but very much along the line that we are, doing extremely well in certain things for all the population. And Canada is another example. So there you go, Now, you don't have to take my word for it. You can just go start digging this up yourself if you want. But that's what's going on here, folks. That's why it's difficult to understand why senators don't just tell Donald Trump to go jump in a lake. We're starting the Republican Party the way it was designed to be in the past. They can't. They can't. He's created a cult, and they let him do it. And the money was behind him to do it. And now the money has a hard time not backing him if he decides to run for office, because he's got a large following, regardless of whether they believe the super rich are behind or not. And by the way, the largest portion of that following, the cult that Trump has, is part of the unequal group financially. They are the everyday workers. It's not just Democrats, it's Republicans and independents, everybody besides the super rich. So this is the dilemma that people are struggling with right now. That's the maneuvering that's going on deeper than the Trumps, the Flynn's, the Stones, the Hawleys, all of the Republicans that are supporting them. It goes deeper down into this, where the money is. And it goes to the deal, the old saying, follow the money and you're going to figure out what's going on. And sure enough, I think that's what's happening here too. So that's a long explanation, but it's something I think, and you don't have to believe it. It's fairly clear to me. If you take a look at all the things that are happening, you kind of understand it. You can understand also, if you look at the Democratic side, why you have a group out there that is professing a highly progressive movement, because they are actually fighting not the Trumps and the Republicans, not the conservative Republican side. I think that would be something where you could see people move to the center on all the things that are right for people, because all of Trump's people are benefiting from everything that's happening out there. They're spending that $1,000 or $1,400 or $3,000 we got for COVID relief. They're taking the child tax credit and using it, and they're taking the money we put into their small businesses, and they're improving. they're trying to keep them alive and trying to keep the small businessman. This is not about mom and pop on Main Street. This is all about a very super rich, several, not a large number, but several super rich cabals or groups of people who are actively engaged at manipulating things to try to get to an unregulated government, a totally unregulated government, which would not help any average person out there at all. It helped them a whole lot. And they're saying, trust us, we'll make it better for you if we get that way. That was the trickle-down economy. It hasn't worked. It hasn't worked since they've been working on it in the 30s. It just hasn't worked. But the good news is, like we said, we all have one vote. So if you're part of that cult of Trump, you're part of the independents that aren't, you're part of the conservative Republicans that aren't, and you're nearly all the Democrats that aren't, with maybe a couple, it makes sense to use that one vote to take care of America and to keep us more in line with equality and not inequality. Hope this is helpful. Like I said, don't trust me on it. These are my thoughts, my ideas, and my opinions only. They always are. They're nobody else's. But they make sense if you think about it. And if you really have concerns, go find the information yourself, like I did. And if you got disagreements, present me some facts, but just don't say I'm wrong, because I don't accept that from anybody anymore. You got to lay down the facts that show it differently. I'm pretty sure this is what's going on. It's pretty evident, but yeah, I might miss something here and there, but I think the trail is still warm. All right. Have a good day. Get out there and vote. Go find out the truth. Don't accept anything from any one specific group. Go pull the information from a variety of groups. And please don't get mad at the Trump group. Don't get mad at that group. They have been unduly influenced. There's no question. I know what that is because I lived under it for a lot of years. It is easy to do. I don't care your income level. I don't care your intelligence level. It's easily at some point in time, it just hits you right, and it's a need you have, and then you realize you made the wrong decision. That does not make them bad people. Whether it's your relative, whether it's your best friend that you've lost or whatever, reconnect again. This time, don't judge them, don't ridicule them. Just get the information and ask questions. Let them discover the answer. That's how it happened. That's how I got out. We discovered stuff. I was one that resisted anybody who said anything against what I was doing. And people kept saying, you're really? And they looked at me like I was crazy. And I just kept feeling like I'm superior because I know. The fact is I wasn't. And that's a horrible feeling to realize you wasted 10 or 15 years of your life looking at the wrong thing. It's a very guilt-ridden thing, but you can get out of it and you can get over it. Then you can help other people. So it doesn't do any good to call them, a cult, or even though they are, it doesn't do them any good to call them that. It doesn't do any good to say they're brainwashed. You can't do that. You have to look at them with compassion and grace, and just keep talking. Just keep talking and answering questions and putting questions in front of them that make them think through what they're doing. And if they can't respond, they're first, they've been trained to turn you off. So that's one thing. They've been trained to just, it's kind of like if they're not getting through to you, and they're just saying, okay, well, you're ignorant, I'm not going to talk to you anymore. And if you allow that to happen, you lose them forever. But if you can say, hey, look, I'm still open, talk to me, knowing that if you question them, eventually you might have hit on something that discredits their leader or discredits what they're learning or makes them see that they are no longer who they used to be, the people that you cared about. All right, have a good day. Till next time, I'm Victor Vogel. This is my podcast.